Now that both of my kids were adults, I no longer had a reason to hold onto the farmhouse outside of city. Selling it made sense for two main reasons. One, I had no ties keeping me there anymore, and two, I was completely done with enduring the brutal winters this region brought year after year. Nothing was keeping me in that cold, unforgiving climate. I wanted to spend the rest of my life basking in the warmth of the sun, preferably with a beautiful woman by my side. That was the dream. My son, Jake, worked as a school teacher in Carolina, while my daughter, Emily, had married and was expecting her first child shortly after Christmas. She and her husband had relocated to California the year before. Maybe the warm weather had something to do with their growing family. With the farm sold, I was in the middle of sorting through the belongings that made up my life here. The moving company would handle the transportation of my things to California. All I had to do was decide what was going and pack up the personal items I wanted to keep. Most of the furniture stayed behind for the new owners, a young couple eager to start their lives in what would be their first real home. The only things I planned to take were my collection of books and the original artwork that adorned the walls. The farm itself spanned roughly 20 acres and featured a sprawling old house, 2 barns, a 4-car detached garage, and what felt like endless fencing for the horses. Realistically, it wasn't miles and miles, but after spending years painting and maintaining those fences, it certainly felt that way. This place held countless memories. It was the first home I purchased for my kids after my wife left me for another man, abandoning our family in search of what she considered a more exciting life. I had watched my twins, Kelly and Brian Jr., grow up here. There had been scraped knees, family arguments, and plenty of laughter over the years. But that was more than 2 decades ago. Maybe I should start from the beginning. My name is David Carter, and I was born in a small town near the southern border of New York State. It was the kind of town where you didn't have to lock your doors at night, and on Sundays, just about everyone attended their respective churches. A quiet place where watching paint dry sometimes felt like the highlight of the week. My mother was college-educated, and thanks to her, I had access to a solid academic foundation. My father ran a small shop, working tirelessly to provide us with a comfortable life. Once I was big enough, my mother convinced my dad that I should take music lessons. Since neither of them played an instrument, they didn't know much about the differences between woodwinds, strings, or percussion. So when they finally decided to buy me an instrument, they walked into a piano store with no real knowledge of what they were getting. At 11 years old, I had only one concern. How in the world was I supposed to lug a piano through the streets during the annual Memorial Day parade? It seemed like an impossible task, but the salesman did his job well. We had gone in looking for a small piano, and somehow walked out having purchased an organ instead. Well, we didn't exactly walk out with it. It was scheduled to be delivered in 2 weeks. It was secondhand, originally bought by a family the year before. However, after the husband was transferred across the country, they decided the cost of shipping it wasn't worth it. That meant we got a great deal on it, since the store had already made its profit the first time it was sold. From that point on, I took weekly lessons and spent an hour each day practicing. At first, my mother insisted I play right after school, but that cut into my time with friends. My dad proposed a compromise. If I practiced immediately after dinner, he would take over my chore of drying the dishes. I hated drying dishes, so this seemed like a perfect arrangement. What I didn't realize at the time was that while drying normally took 15 minutes, my dad managed to stretch it out to an hour, ensuring I practiced longer than I had originally planned. By the time I caught on to his trick, I had already grown to enjoy playing, so I didn't mind anymore. When I reached my teenage years, I fell in love with rock and roll. The only problem? Organs weren't exactly a staple in rock bands back then. Most groups were built around guitars and drums, so I had to figure out how to replicate those sounds using my hands and feet. I got pretty good at it, learning to mimic the styles of various bands. During my senior year, my guidance counselor encouraged me to apply to a music school rather than a traditional college. To my surprise, I was invited to audition at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. My music teacher helped me refine my classical pieces and technique in the weeks leading up to the audition, but by the time the day arrived, my nerves had completely taken over. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. I remember sitting on a bench outside the practice room, surrounded by other applicants. No one spoke. We were all too busy worrying about how we would measure up against one another. When my name was finally called, I stepped into the audition room to find 3 women seated near a piano. The problem? I didn't play piano. Organs and pianos require completely different techniques, and I had never developed the touch needed for the latter. I froze in place, staring at the instrument like it was some kind of cruel joke. "Is something wrong, Mr. Carter?" one of the women asked. I simply nodded. "Please explain," she pressed. "We don't have all day." I don't play piano," I admitted. "I'm an organist." One of them raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying you've never learned to play piano at all?" "Yes, ma'am," I answered. "I started learning on an organ when I was a kid. If I had known piano was required for this audition, I wouldn't have even bothered coming." The 3 judges exchanged whispers before one of them stood and left the room. She returned 5 minutes later, smiling. "Mr. Carter, grab your things and follow us," she instructed. "We found an organ that's currently available for your audition." As I trailed behind them through the grand halls of the building, I was awestruck. The early 1900s architecture was stunning: marble floors, ornately carved oak doors, and elegant brass light fixtures. The sound of music drifted through the air as we neared a set of massive double doors. One of the women pushed them open, and the volume swelled tenfold. Inside, an orchestra was wrapping up its practice session. "The Philharmonic is just finishing up," one of the women explained. Another added, "Actually, it's the jazz ensemble. They play more modern music." The conductor brought them to a dramatic crescendo before addressing his musicians. "The school is holding an organ audition for a prospective student. We all know how nerve-wracking these can be, so please exit quietly." As the musicians filed out, many of them smiled at me and nodded, acknowledging my presence. It was surreal. These professionals were treating me, a 17-year-old kid from a tiny town, as if I belonged among them. But there was no time to revel in the moment. I had an audition to complete. 2 grueling hours later, I was finally done. Weeks later, I returned home from school to find my mother waiting for me with news. "The Eastman School called this morning," she said. "You've been accepted, full scholarship, 4 years. You start in the fall." That was how I spent the next 4 years of my life. A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, pulling me from my memories. October had arrived, bringing with it the bitter chill of the coming winter. I wouldn't miss this weather at all. California awaited, where days were warmer, skies were clearer, and cold fronts weren't welcome. If I wanted any luck with women, I had to hit the bars that featured live bands. And let me tell you, I needed that kind of luck often. Otherwise, let's just say my hands started cramping up. The problem was, I was still just a low-paid office clerk with rent and a car payment draining my wallet every month. Adding club covers, drinks, and tips to the mix put a serious strain on my budget. Most nights, I ended up sitting around with the guys, sharing cheap pitchers of beer. I only splurged on the more expensive clubs on Friday and Saturday nights, nursing 1 or 2 drinks for hours while trying to look effortlessly cool. It was on one of those Friday nights that I met Lisa. She was about 5 feet 6 inches with curves in all the right places, a knockout, no doubt. She was bubbly, flirty, and had a magnetism that drew every guy in the room to her. We spent most of the night dancing and talking, getting to know each other between songs. After a couple of weeks of this routine, I finally managed to get her out to the parking lot and into the back seat of my car. Unfortunately, my victory was short-lived. We kissed, fooled around a bit, but every time things started heating up, she pulled away and insisted we head back inside. Since she was a woman, she had no trouble walking right back into the club. I, on the other hand, got stopped at the door because I didn't have the cash to cover re-entry. That night, I walked away frustrated. About a month later, I ran into Lisa again. She was sitting with a group of friends, sipping her drink while batting off a handful of eager guys vying for her attention. Some she danced with, others she turned down. When I made my way toward her, she greeted me with a bright smile. "Hey, David." "Hey, Lisa. Want to dance?" She agreed, and we hit the packed dance floor. Halfway through the second song, some random guy walked up, wrapped his arms around her, and planted a deep, possessive kiss on her lips. Before I could react, she threw her arms around him, lifted one leg, and melted into him like they were starring in their own romantic movie. That was my cue. I turned around, heading back to the bar where I'd left my drink. But when I got there, I found that my drink was gone, my stool was taken, and my jacket had vanished. Just my luck. As I waited for the bartender to make his way back over to me, I caught sight of Lisa and her new fling slipping out the door into the parking lot. Guess that told me exactly where I stood with her. That freezing walk back to my apartment hardened my feelings toward her. Over the next few months, I'd spot Lisa at different clubs, and while we'd acknowledge each other with a nod or a glance, I never went out of my way to talk to her again. Instead, I focused on hitting on other women, ones who were actually interested in me. Now, I wasn't bad-looking by any means. At 6 feet 0 inches, 190 pounds, with dark hair and striking blue eyes, I was told more than once by women that I was easy on the eyes. But I had also been told I was a little too shy. Maybe they were right. My mother had raised me to be respectful around women, and I guess that came across as hesitation. One night, as I was sitting out a dance, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "David, don't you want to dance with me anymore?" I turned to see Lisa standing there, her expression playful. "I'm just sitting this one out," I said, feigning disinterest. "Gotta save my energy for work tomorrow, you know?" "But I want to dance," she pouted. "This club is packed," I said flatly. "I'm sure plenty of guys would love to dance with a pretty girl like you, and maybe even walk you out to the parking lot afterward." My tone was bitter, and she knew it. She opened her mouth to respond, but I was already on my feet, heading for the door. She started after me, but a couple of guys intercepted her, showering her with attention. As the door closed behind me, the last thing I saw was her smiling and flirting with them. There wasn't exactly a big city, which meant there were only so many clubs with decent live music. Because of that, Lisa and I kept crossing paths, week after week. We never spoke, but sometimes I could feel her eyes on me. This routine continued for months. It might have dragged on indefinitely if not for what happened one night. As I was walking to my truck, I heard a woman's voice making sounds that definitely didn't belong in a happy situation. Instinctively, I followed the noise, scanning the lot for trouble. Along the way, I grabbed a push broom leaning against a dumpster and snapped the wooden handle in half, creating a solid makeshift club. If someone was in danger, I wasn't about to walk away. Then I heard fabric tearing, a man's voice cursing in pain, a fist connecting with flesh. I broke into a sprint. When I rounded the back of a parked car, I saw two men pinning a woman to the ground. One had her arms restrained while the other was trying to yank her jeans over her shoes. And that woman? Lisa. Her eyes were wide with terror as she fought them off. I didn't hesitate. Swinging the broom handle with everything I had, I smashed it into the face of the guy holding her down. His nose exploded in blood as he fell back, screaming. The second man scrambled to his feet, abandoning his attempt to undress her. I didn't give him the chance to react. I cracked the wooden club against the side of his head. He staggered, but didn't go down, so I hit him again, and again, and again. I don't know how many times I hit him. I might have kept going until I killed him if someone hadn't grabbed me from behind and dragged me away. The bouncers restrained me until the police arrived. After sorting through the situation, the two men were taken to the hospital and later charged with attempted sexual assault. A detective questioned me about what happened. He lectured me about the dangers of getting involved and how I could have been seriously hurt. Then, as he patted my shoulder, he whispered, "Good job, son." Later, I found out that those two had been responsible for multiple assaults in the area. A female officer approached me, leading Lisa, who was wrapped in a blanket. Her jeans were torn, and the remains of her bra barely held her modesty together. The moment she saw me, she broke down in sobs and latched onto me, refusing to let go. I had no idea where she lived, so I took her back to my apartment. I figured I'd set her up in my bed and crash on the couch. That didn't happen. For the next 3 nights, the only way she could sleep was if I held her. Every time I tried to leave, she woke up screaming. So I stayed. And yeah, I won't lie. It wasn't exactly a hardship, holding a half-dressed woman all night. But I kept things respectful. 6 months later, when her lease expired, she didn't renew it. In fact, she hadn't even stepped foot in her apartment since that night. I could understand why a woman might leave a husband, but abandoning her own children? That was something I could never rationalize. There had to be something fundamentally missing in Lisa. Maybe she lacked the maternal instinct entirely. The sound of tires scraping against the curb pulled me from my thoughts. He was still getting the hang of driving, and while replacing tires was far cheaper than repairing bodywork on the car or a person, I really wished he'd pick up the skill a little faster. He was rough on vehicles, and even rougher on my wallet. That night, after dinner, Beth and I sat the kids down and explained why she was staying with us. I made it crystal clear that under no circumstances could anyone find out she was here. To their friends, Beth was just a distant cousin visiting from the West Coast. I promised them years of being grounded if they so much as hinted otherwise. Apparently, the threat worked because they both stayed unusually quiet as they headed off to bed. Beth watched them disappear down the hallway before turning to me with a soft frown. "David, don't you think that was a little harsh?" "No," I said firmly. "Kids talk before they think. The last thing I need is for your visit to end up as breaking news." She sighed but nodded. "I see your point, and I respect it. I just hate to see them scared when they haven't done anything wrong. But for what it's worth, you've done an incredible job raising them. I can see that, and I've only been here a day." "Thank you," I said. "It's been tough, but I never walked away from them like their mother did." The mood had grown heavy, so I changed the subject, steering the conversation toward music. Later, we moved to my music room, where we spent the entire night working on songs. By the time we finally called it quits, the sun was rising over the horizon. One of the few benefits of raising teenagers is that they love to sleep in whenever possible. My two were no exception. It was nearly 10 a.m. before they started stirring. I got up, threw on some clothes, and went downstairs to quiet them down. Beth needed her rest, especially since we had been up all night writing. She was also still adjusting from West Coast time, which made sleep even more crucial. To buy myself a little peace, I promised the kids I'd make their favorite breakfast after I showered. A little bribery never hurt. 30 minutes later, as I walked out of my bedroom, my nose was greeted by the most incredible smells I'd ever experienced in that house. Curious, I followed the scent into the kitchen, only to be completely floored by what I saw. Beth was at the stove, cooking. That in itself wasn't shocking. The real surprise? Emily was helping. Now, my daughter had never once shown any interest in cooking. Getting her to load the dishwasher was a battle, let alone getting her to use anything in the kitchen. "Hey, Dad," she greeted enthusiastically. "Beth's teaching me how to cook. The eggs and bacon are almost done. Want some pancakes, too? We made the batter from scratch." Beth stood off to the side, beaming with pride. I could hear the excitement in my daughter's voice, and it made my heart swell. "I'll take a little of everything," I said, smiling. Breakfast was fantastic. Extra crispy pancakes and all. And teenage boys? They'll eat anything, so I have no complaints. Emily was proud of herself, and honestly, so was I. Afterward, Beth and I tackled the mess left behind. It had been a long time since I'd seen Emily this happy, and it reminded me just how much she needed a positive female presence in her life. Later that afternoon, as Beth and I were taking a break from writing, she turned to me with a serious expression. "Emily needs a strong female role model, David," she said. "If you're okay with it, I'd like to be that person for her." I hadn't expected that. "Beth, I'd love that," I admitted. "But there are a few challenges. First, you're only here for a few weeks. And second, we have to think about how she'll feel when you leave." "I've already thought about that," she said quickly. "First, there's the phone. We can talk every day. Second, you and I are making some amazing music together. After I head back home, I still need to do some studio work and record everything. Once that's done, I'll be back to work with you again." She gave me a pointed look before adding, "And when summer comes, I'd like Emily to spend some time with me in California. She needs this, David, and I promise I'll take good care of her." Before I could respond, Emily came bouncing into the studio. "Why are you guys taking a break? I want to hear what you've written." Then she turned to Beth and added, "You know, my dad is the greatest songwriter in the world." Tears burned the back of my eyes. Beth reached over and squeezed my hand. "So, do we have a deal?" I didn't trust my voice to answer, so I just nodded like an idiot. Beth smiled. Great. Now, how about some tea? The songwriting process took almost 2 months. Since I still had my regular job to juggle, we worked late into the nights, creating nearly 2 albums worth of music. During that time, Emily and Beth became practically inseparable. Wherever Beth went, Emily wasn't far behind. As Beth's departure date loomed closer, Emily became quieter. One night, the two of them disappeared into Emily's room and shut the door. About an hour later, Emily came running downstairs and threw herself into my lap. "Daddy, you're the best dad in the world," she cried, hugging me tightly. I looked up to see Beth standing in the doorway, smiling. "I told her about our summer plans," she explained. "I guess she wants to visit me." Emily nodded excitedly. I shook my head in amusement. "Well, I hope you're ready, Beth. She's going to talk your ear off." Beth left for California soon after, but she and Emily spoke every single day. Eventually, I had to get my daughter her own phone with unlimited minutes just so I could use my own landline again. Beth's album dropped, and it soared to the top of the charts. Everywhere I went, I heard that unmistakable voice belting out my songs. It was surreal. Months later, I found myself standing in the airport, waiting for her plane to arrive. She stepped off in disguise, brown wig, padding to make her appear heavier, dark glasses. But I'd recognize her anywhere. That time, she stayed for 4 months. Christmas came and went, and 2 nights later, I woke up to someone climbing into my bed. That familiar voice whispered in my ear, "Here's the rest of your Christmas present." We didn't get much sleep that night, or the next morning. Beth had to leave in May, and as I watched her pack, I felt a deep sadness settle over me. "I'm going to miss you," I admitted. She smiled softly. "I'll be back, David. You haven't gotten rid of me yet." Little did I know how much that promise would mean. Lisa, my ex-wife, never returned home. Her life had become a cycle of nothing but drugs and sex. Sometimes with men, sometimes with women, whatever was required to get her next fix. She wasn't using crack, though. This was something else, something even worse. Her entire existence boiled down to chasing that next high. She had no sense of self, no identity outside of her addiction. She remembered the horrifying things she had done, things she had been forced to do. She had engaged in unspeakable acts with strangers, with groups, even with animals. She had danced naked on stages, exposed herself, performed for men and women alike. But eventually, she deteriorated into a full-blown junkie, too far gone to even function. When she could no longer perform, Tom, her so-called man, decided she was no longer worth keeping. He sold her. Lisa was handed over to men she didn't know, and soon, she found herself trafficked across the border into Mexico, where she was kept in a brothel. She was drugged constantly, and if any of her clients were dissatisfied, she was beaten. The pain was endless, except for the brief relief that came with each shot of drugs they gave her to keep her compliant. She lost track of time, of days, of years. All she knew was filth, pain, and the momentary escape of the needle. She didn't remember much from those years. Her existence was reduced to small meals, ice-cold baths in dirty water, and being chained to a cot, waiting to be used. There was no affection, no pleasure, nothing human about it. She wasn't a person, just a body, an object to be violated. The pain had been unbearable at first, but eventually, she went numb. Her body accepted what was happening. Her mind learned to shut down. Then one day, she realized she was pregnant. It didn't matter. They chained her to a cot with only a wire mesh underneath her, and a doctor came. No anesthesia, no kindness. Just cold instruments and agony. Lisa screamed until she lost consciousness. A week later, they put her back to work. Only this time, she felt nothing. No pain, no sensation. She had been permanently damaged, robbed of even the ability to feel. The doctor had made sure of that. Her reward? If the men were satisfied, she got her shot. If not, she screamed through the night until they finally gave her just enough drugs to keep her from convulsing before she was forced to endure it all over again. Lisa had no idea how long she remained in that hell. Then, one day, she was thrown into the back of a van with 2 other women. Except they weren't breathing. They were just bodies now. Women who had been used up and discarded. The van reeked of urine, death, and hopelessness as it rumbled down a dirt road. She knew where they were going. She'd heard about it before. How the traffickers would drive deep into the desert, where the bodies of girls like her were dumped, nameless, forgotten, left to rot beneath the sand. She only hoped they would kill her first before burying her. She had been terrified of being buried alive since childhood. Lisa tried to think of a way to take her own life before they had the chance. But her mind was too fogged with withdrawal, too slow, too weak. Then, suddenly, the van stopped. Gunfire erupted outside. Screams. Chaos. The sounds of men dying. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bullets to find her next. Then silence. The van doors creaked open, and she heard someone gag from the stench before slamming them shut again. Then there was the roar of an engine as a truck drove away. She wasn't dead. She was alone. Lisa managed to kick open the doors and rolled onto the cold desert floor. She didn't know how, but the next time she opened her eyes, she had dragged herself into the driver's seat of the abandoned van. The traffickers were dead. Animals had already started feasting on their remains. She found their stash of drugs and hoarded it, rationing out doses to keep withdrawal at bay. There wasn't enough to keep her high, but at least she wasn't in agony. She also found food and water, just enough to last a week. Before she ran out, a poor farmer stumbled upon her and took her to his village. The villagers didn't turn her away. They took her in, wrapped her in a blanket, and delivered her to the priest. For 6 long months, Lisa suffered through withdrawal. The doctor sat with her as she screamed, convulsed, and begged for relief. The priest and the nuns prayed over her, whispering soft words as she fought against her demons. When she finally emerged from the haze, she wasn't the same person anymore. Lisa had been left with only one eye. She had no memory of how or when she had lost the other. The first time they gave her a mirror, she broke down in sobs. At one time, she had been beautiful. Now, she was disfigured. That night, she tried to take her own life. A nun caught her and bandaged her wrists. From that point on, the nuns took turns watching her, keeping her from harming herself. They even removed all mirrors from her room. It was a year before they gave her one again. This time, she didn't cry. She simply asked for a clean eye patch. When she finally studied the calendar, she realized 16 years had passed since the day she had met her old friend Sherry at the mall. She wanted to go home. Lisa had no money, no passport, nothing tying her to the life she had abandoned. The small village took up a collection to buy her a bus ticket, but it only got her as far as Mexico City. From there, she worked odd jobs, slowly saving enough to make it to the U.S. border. When she finally arrived, they refused to let her in. She had no ID, no proof of citizenship. For 2 more years, she remained in limbo, drifting from place to place. Eventually, someone gave her a green card, though it listed her nationality as Brazilian. It didn't matter. She was back on U.S. soil. She spent another year hitchhiking and working odd jobs, inching her way closer to my city. When she arrived at her old address, a woman answered the door and told her that her family had moved away over a decade ago. Lisa hadn't even been invited inside. Using the last of her money, she rented a cheap room in a nearby village and took a job cleaning office buildings at night. Slowly, she pieced together an address, one that led her to a small farm in Minden, New York. She had finally found them. She hitchhiked the last stretch, her heart pounding with every mile. It was cold and raining when she arrived. The temperature cut through her like a blade. She had spent so many years in the heat of the desert that she had forgotten what true cold felt like. She had no coat, no protection against the elements. But she was almost there. Lisa made her way up the long driveway, trembling from more than just the chill. The house was massive. There were only a few lights glowing in the back. As she reached the porch, the rain turned heavy, nearly freezing. She rang the bell. The door opened, and for the first time in 20 years, she looked into my eyes. She felt lightheaded. She was home, but I didn't move. I stared at her, my face unreadable. And then, without a word, I shut the door in her face. The last thing she remembered before darkness overtook her was the sound of her own body collapsing against the wooden porch. After everything I had learned about Lisa's suffering, I called Beth immediately to update her. When I finished explaining, Beth's response was immediate. "Bring her home to us, David." Her voice was soft but firm. "She doesn't deserve to die alone." It took another week to finalize everything. Actually, Beth handled most of the arrangements. Her name carried far more weight than mine did, and with a single phone call, she secured a private jet from one of her business acquaintances. That's how Lisa and I ended up flying west. Not in a cramped commercial flight, but in quiet luxury, with warm blankets and flight attendants who treated Lisa with kindness she hadn't known in decades. When we landed, Beth was already waiting for us. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around me, grounding me, steadying me. She didn't speak. She just held me for a long moment before turning to Lisa. "Welcome home," Beth said simply. Lisa's eyes welled up, but she only nodded. Together, Beth and I moved Lisa into our home, setting up a comfortable space for her with a full-time health aide to help. There were good days and bad days. Some mornings, Lisa would wake up and sit outside in the garden, just breathing in the California air. Other times, she wouldn't get out of bed at all. The disease was progressing fast, and we all knew our time with her was limited. The first time Lisa saw Emily, I don't think any of us were prepared for the moment. Emily had 7 months of pregnancy rounding out her frame, though she looked closer to 10. When Lisa saw her daughter for the first time in 20 years, her child, now a grown woman carrying life inside her, she broke down sobbing. Emily rushed forward to embrace her, but Lisa pushed her away. "No," Lisa gasped, shaking her head, backing up as if her own touch was toxic. "I'm dirty. I have an STD. I won't do anything to harm you or your baby." The room was silent. Tears welled in Emmy's eyes, but she nodded, respecting her mother's boundaries. Beth and I stepped back, leaving them alone. The three of them, mother, daughter, and unborn grandchild, stayed in Lisa's room for hours, talking in hushed voices, making up for lost time. When Emily finally emerged that evening, she kissed my cheek and said, "Dad, I'll be back tomorrow. I need to know my mother before it's too late." And she did. For the remainder of Lisa's time with us, Emily visited almost every day. She only missed 4 days, and that was when she went into labor. Emily gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. When Beth broke the news to Lisa, they held each other and cried. The baby was named Mary Beth, a name that honored both her biological grandmother and the woman who had raised Emily in Lisa's absence. The first time Emily brought little Mary to meet her grandmothers, Lisa wept again, staring in awe at the tiny bundle in her daughter's arms. She never held the baby. She was too afraid of cross-contamination, but she watched, she smiled, she cried. Beth, who was now officially my wife, held Mary Beth close, rocking her gently as Lisa looked on, knowing this was the closest she would ever get. While Emily had forgiven Lisa enough to reconnect, our son never did. He refused to visit. He refused to acknowledge her. In his eyes, Lisa had abandoned him, and he had spent 20 years living with that wound. When I explained this to Lisa, she nodded in understanding. But later that night, I found her crying silently in her room. She never mentioned son again. The next 6 months passed too fast. Lisa was fading, slipping away from us a little more each day. One morning, when the health aide arrived, she found Lisa had passed in her sleep. We cremated her and placed her ashes in a decorative pavilion in our garden. There's a small bench there, a quiet space where we take turns sitting, updating her on family life. I hope she found the peace she had been searching for all those years. Life is strange, isn't it? The paths we take, the choices we make, and the consequences that ripple through time. Lisa's story was one of loss, suffering, and redemption. She made her mistakes, terrible mistakes, but in the end, she found her way home. She wasn't alone when she died. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Dear readers, what are your thoughts on Lisa's journey? Did she deserve redemption? Would you have forgiven her? Could you ever forgive someone who abandoned you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.